right, moving along, we're going to start talking about space power theory now. And leading us through this discussion is Dr. Brent Ziarnick. He is an assistant professor of space power at U.S. Air Force Air Command and Staff College. In addition to having 2 doctorate degrees, he also holds a MSc and M.E degree. He is a space power theorist, professional military education professor, and Air Force Reserve officer. In addition, he has authored at least 2 books, To Rule the Skies and 21st Century Power. Please welcome Mr. Brent Ziarnick.
Thanks a lot for letting me be here. And thank you very much for letting me go after Trey York and Josh Carlson, because I get to tailor my presentation a little bit off of their excellent ones. And I have to say to Trey specifically, you saved my bacon on some of this, because you went over a lot of the slides that I was going to feel I was going to have to slog through in order to make it in time. So thank you very much. But I actually have 3 books out, and I was going to talk about my first one, but I would like to talk about the Blue Water School again. And I want to talk about it as an actual proponent of the Blue Water School, something that it's definitely not new, but it's sort of it has a new lease on life a little bit. And again, thank you for Mr. York about his great presentation. I would like to try to take it in a different way, which is, I would argue that the argument between the Blue Water School and the Brown Water School is not resource prioritization. It is actually cultural. But before I get into it, I just want to give you the standard disclaimer. I am an Air University, an Air Force employee. I'm an instructor. I'm a professor here. The views I have are in this presentation are only my own, and they're governed and given in the spirit of academic freedom. So what is this brown versus blue thing about? Well, I want to go into caricatures right now, because honestly, a lot of what I hear about blue water thinking in the Space Force is a caricature that the blue water people want the Space Force to become Starfleet, and are thinking 200 years ahead. I would say there's a little bit of truth to that, but it is a caricature. I will respond by another caricature about the Brown Water School of Space Force, that they're perfectly willing to have a U.S. Space Command, our chief warfighting space officer, be an Army general in a uniform that is almost a century old. Those are both caricatures. So let's try to get in on what these schools actually are. Now, this slide is almost exactly like Mr. York, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but I want to bring up something that Mr. Carlson came up with, which is the big difference between the brown versus blue water space schools are the theory of victory. I think that's actually very, very close to being accurate, in that the brown water folks tend to focus on joint integration, and joint integration specifically for terrestrial combat. It's very tactical, I would argue. Whereas the Blue Water School is definitely more whole of government, in that it is maritime inspired, in that why do nations go to the sea? They go to the sea for wealth and safety. And this is a very analogous thing to what we can do in space. And therefore, we have to be, the Blue Water School at least thinks that we have to be far more thinking about whole of government and more strategic oriented. But come back to where I'm, my cultural point. I would say that the Blue Water School is nothing but space enthusiasm applied in a military context. You're going to see a lot of the people that sort of spout blue water thinking in the Space Force be people that have been in the National Space Society for years, that read the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, that watch Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and stuff like that, because they breathe vacuum in a way that the early air power advocates were born to the air. I really do think that if you consider it from a cultural context, the blue water folks are mostly space enthusiasts at a cultural level. And our claim to resources, especially Space Force resources, are not as big as some people claim. But really, what is the practical reason for why this matters at all? You know, what's the difference between a brown water school and a blue water school? Well, it matters when we deal with something not military related, like Starship, the SpaceX rocket that they're developing right now. It's not SpaceX specific. It could be anything. The Artemis Accords, Blue Origin's Blue Moon or New Glenn rocket, anything that's not, you know, a space elevator or a lunar elevator. It could be anything. But let's use the Starship because I think it's a very useful example. Well, if you don't know what the Starship is, this is from the user's manual from SpaceX. It's supposed to be a fully reusable transportation system that can take people or things to Earth orbit, the moon, or Mars, be it satellites, any other kind of payload, crew, and cargo. Right? This is a cargo vessel for space. And its specs are, quite honestly, excellent if they get it to work. It is designed to carry up to 100 tons of cargo, which could be 100 people to the moon and Mars. And it has variants that we really haven't seen in space before. A crew variant, a cargo variant, and even a refueler variant, which is an old air, I was in the air power department until I was in the space power department. And I will tell you that nothing seems more beautiful to me than an old 1960s era SAC aircraft, with nice shiny aluminum. And the idea that a refueling spaceship will look an awful lot like a 1960s era KC-135 just, excites the heck out of me. So I'm still an airman quite a bit. But back to the specs, it will take a lot of mass to orbit, and it will take a lot of mass farther than orbit. And it represents an unbelievably increase in the amount of access whoever owns it has to the space domain. But now we have to try to consider what each school would think about Starship. And I would argue that the brown water school, which brown water people don't identify themselves as brown water people. Blue water people identify them as brown water people. But this school is mostly ambivalent to Starship. It is not what they're interested in. It's not their job. And they will say things that will indicate that they're not really thinking that much about something like Starship. Ambivalent towards commercial developments that aren't directly related to military or joint interests. On the other hand, a blue water school thinker takes a look at Starship and says, this is perhaps the most important craft in, space right now. Why? Because it's, to use an air power analogy and then a sea power analogy, it is the DC-3 of space. What is the DC-3? A commercial aircraft that opened up transportation to everybody in ways that it never had before. Or if you're more naval minded, you can say it's sort of the cookie cutter merchant ship that will allow you to transport lots of cargo around the solar system, at least the inner solar system. But what it is, it's a commercial interest, SpaceX, leading revolutionary space transportation breakthroughs in a way that we've never seen before, similar to commercial enterprise in the air and sea domains. Now think about it from a military perspective, the Starship. If you think about the DC-3, what do we know it as in World War II and Vietnam? Well, the C-47, which carried troops, paratroops, into battle on D-Day. It turned into the AC-47, which is the prototype for the gunship that we have today. The DC-3 is a commercial a commercial endeavor that was successfully transmitted to military use, good use in the military. And Starship, to blue water thinkers, could provide unparalleled space superiority for the United States if it develops correctly and the US keeps it to primarily itself. Why? Because the SpaceX Starship has the opportunity to move better than anything else and has a whole lot of payload that might allow it to shoot and communicate as necessary in a military context if purchased by someone like the US Space Force for use for US Space Command. It's important to note that some of this work is already being done, although mostly based on, not a whole heck of a lot of money, and mostly out of enthusiasm for the topic in commercial industry and in some places in the military, such as US Transportation Command or Air Mobility Command. But not to get too much of an air power link to it, a better view of something like a Starship might be the old World War I and pre-World War I naval concept of an auxiliary cruiser, which means a commercially designed vessel that, if properly supported by the military or the government with certain military adjustments, could be pressed into service if needed as a military instrument of national power. Auxiliary cruisers were civilian ships that in times of war could be given a couple of guns and go out to harass adversary shipping or enemy shipping. The Starship might be able to play a similar role no matter what. But what is the SpaceX deployment plan for these things? Well, Mr. Carlson came up with it a little bit earlier. Elon Musk wants to have 1 million Martians by 2050. He said that. Do you believe it? Doesn't matter. He said it. And 2050 seems like a long way away. But the lieutenants that are in the Space Force right now may well be, one of them may well be Chief of Space Operations by 2050. This is not some futuristic thing. This is something that people that are alive now may well have to deal with. But how to do it? How does Elon Musk attempt to do this? Well, he wants to have 1,000 Starships in service, I think, for SpaceX itself. And by doing that, they're going to produce 100 Starships per year and have a 20 to 30 year service life for each. And with that fleet, he thinks he can transfer up to 100 megatons of cargo per year to Mars, with 100,000 people going there at about $500,000 a ticket. Again, it doesn't matter whether you believe that or not. Let's say he only gets to about 1/10 of that. That still means we're going to have to deal with 100,000 people on Mars in the span of hopefully a lot of our lifetimes. But if you think about that deployment plan from a military perspective, it looks an awful lot like an American flagged merchant marine, provided SpaceX stays in the United States and provided the US government supports it. Now, one thing that I do want to say is that it looks like a merchant marine, not a Civil Reserve space fleet based off the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. Why? Because the merchant marine is designed to do something else than military stuff. And when the military uses it, it's designed, the merchant marine uses, it does the same thing for, essentially military purposes, but it's still a money-making venture. Whereas a Civil Reserve space fleet, based on the craft, sort of breaks that that commercial model quite a bit. But we could get into it a little bit later, but it takes a lot of discussion. So we'll just move on. That SpaceX may well develop a merchant marine for space. Now, will Starship happen? Well, even a couple of days ago, the SN9 mission sort of, it flew beautifully. The landing could probably use a little work. So certain people are right to be a little bit skeptical. But the fact is because, SpaceX blows up a lot of these. How are they able to blow up a lot of these? Because they build a lot of these and are flying a lot of these. And let's remember that it wasn't NASA that got America back to flying their own astronauts. It was essentially SpaceX. Now, of course, it was with a lot of NASA money, but NASA put a lot more money around Boeing, and Boeing still has not flown yet. So SpaceX tends to do what it tends to, what it tends to say it's going to do. And right now, it seems like landing is what the Starship's problem is. So it's just scaling up. One of these things that they've been doing with the Falcon for a while is showing a little bit of problems. I'm fairly certain that problem will be corrected at some point. But what does Starship mean for the Space Force? Well, here's where culture comes to play, and prioritization of resourcing isn't as much, or it's something that we have to think about, but maybe not in the way Mr. York was saying. If Starship works, brown water interests, this supporting to the warfighter and terrestrial services, space services being respected, that's going to be covered. Why? Because we're going to be able to move, shoot, and communicate anywhere in space and rapidly reconstitute, constellations that the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and the Marine Corps needs way better than we can now. So in a lot of ways, the Blue Water School can accomplish brown water missions better than the Brown Water School can. But more than that, we have to look beyond brown water thinking to determine why we will be fighting in space. And is it that we're going to take pot shots at each other's satellites for an Army version of space control, or fighting over the lines of communication in a more maritime inspired thought of space control? We need to understand why before we can understand really how the fighting is going to happen. But even beyond that, are our adversaries developing a Starship-like capability? Are they buying it? Are they stealing it? We need to know. It would be better for us to be first. But if we're going to be second, we're going to have to be a fast follower. That goes with the equipment and the thinking behind it. And I would argue that Starship means the Space Force has to evolve beyond tactical warfare and into strategic competition, going from cultural brown water to cultural blue water. But I'm going to close with this by saying, as a blue water partisan, the Space Force needs the Blue Water School. And I'm going to argue that the Space Force leadership must acknowledge the legitimacy of Blue Water School thinking in the Space Force. They do not need to embrace it. It's a significant difference. The Starship is going to be built and flown using SpaceX money. They do not need Space Force money. It might help, but it's not necessary. So Space Force leadership can sit back and watch to see if the Blue Water School's hopes for Starship actually works. But one thing that does have to be done, let the Guardians that are in the Space Force now who want to embrace the Blue Water School do so without worry. I would say culturally, the Space Force, the Blue Water School isn't losing. Culturally, it's very ascendant. Blue Water started cislunar discussions in that term in military operations, but it has been suppressed. And it's been suppressed mostly by senior leader dismissal of Blue Water concerns. Every time there was a document that could be considered, Blue Water thinking, there's been a response by people in senior leadership saying, well, that's not what the Space Force does. We need to educate our people better. We need to educate America better. I don't think that's good. I think we should say that we need to replace that's not what we do with that's not our focus at this particular time. And I think if we do that, we will change this, PR problem that we're just now starting to admit to, although many people have recognized in the Space Force. Is it really education that the Space Force needs to do? Or is it selling the Space Force to the American people? And American people don't generally think too highly or are very excited about brown water stuff. but they are very excited about blue water stuff. And when the Space Force says maybe your purpose on the planet isn't on this planet, that has a blue water connotation, but it does not, it does not tie the Space Force's star to specific blue water issues. It can be blue or brown water, depending on how you think of it, but you have to, leave all the options on the table for the Space Force to figure out what it is supposed to do. And the US Space Force has used this clean sheet doctrine, they call it, mostly as a reason for not taking action on the Space Force Reserve, but I digress. We don't know what the Space Force is supposed to be like. We don't. I might be wrong as a blue water thinker. The brown water people might be wrong. And we are just not going to know. But the way that we compromise is by saying, however the space domain evolves, we pledge that the US Space Force will be there guarding those who love freedom everywhere on or off the planet. I think that is a much better approach than what has happened in the Space Force so far, because ultimately we need brown water folks in the Space Force to keep the wild-eyed people honest, but we need blue water folks to make sure that the Space Force advances the art of national power in space like it was supposed to do. So that's what I've got about the difference between the blue water and brown water folks culturally. Again, thanks to Mr. York for doing his stuff, because I'd probably be here for another 10 minutes. So that's all I've got. I will give you.
Terrific. Dr. Ziarnick, thank you so much. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Just to let everybody else know, just after Major McLean, we're going to have a short, but I think pretty spirited conversation amongst these three plus Sean. You're all coming from slightly different perspectives. I think you all have your I would say your head in the game. I have to do my part as the host to remind everybody that these are personal opinions of the folks speaking. They have careers on the line. We can't mess with that. And especially the public affairs officers want us to make sure that we say that. So these are all personal opinions. But given that it's your personal opinion, I will say for me, it resonates with me. So let's talk about the future, but not the big future, not the 2060 that we were talking about earlier. 2021, the rest of this year, there's some proposals going to Congress. We just found out that that the force is called the Guardians. We found out that we don't yet have warrant officer ranks yet. We know that this is an evolving thing, right? Like literally every day, every week, something new that is evolving. So bring out your crystal ball. What does 2022 look like? It's right around the corner. What does 2025 look like? And where are we? If you're right, like lots of other people can be right also, but if you're right, where are we in 2035? So next year, 2022, 2035.
Gosh, it's hard to say, because I'm going to try to dodge and say, the thing is with the blue water folks, some people tend to think that we want to take the entire Space Force's budget. I really don't think that's true. The biggest space, or the biggest blue water thing that I wanted at the very least was Navy ranks. That's free, or at least it costs us a couple of $100 for maybe new uniforms. But for me, if I'm right, next year for the Space Force, no change. Not really much of one, except for the cultural change, where I would hope that more people would start writing, more of the young people would start writing. and you start to add into the FIDEP and other things like that, an experimentation squadron, buying a little bit of this off-the-shelf equipment and having our young folks, enlisted and officers and civilians, playing with it and seeing what we can do with it. Not a huge budget, not a whole lot of that. I've heard the chief scientist of the Space Force. Well, I did not want to do that. I've heard other people say that, if we could just play around with a little bit of the budget, we could really figure out what we need to do in the future. Leverage the heck out of the civilian community. That's what the Blue Water folks are all about. We don't need a whole lot of money. Buy a Starship before the Air Force does. That'll be a big one. But then when you get into 2025, maybe not a whole lot different. Maybe we start flying Starships as Space Force personnel, depending on how quickly assuming the Starship happens, right? And then 2035, if that happens, we did not revolutionize anything. We evolved the Space Force concurrently with commercial space to have a whole new approach to space based on a flourishing of our ability to access space. There was no big change. I think naturally naval kind of thinking, or at least maritime kind of thinking, is going to be recognized more and more as the way that we need to start thinking about things. Because even brown water is a Navy concept, but it would really be an evolution where, of course, we're still going to be doing GPS and a lot of our global utilities. My next hope is to try to get this global utilities idea back in the talk of Space Force thinking and stuff like that. But you're going to do a lot of the same missions that we've always done, because Brown, supports the terrestrial warfighter is important, and it's easily done by the Space Force. But then you're going to see more of being out there in deep space, along with NASA and the commercial entities more, will probably be there too. And there might be shore assignments versus deep black assignments or anything like that. But it's not impossible to go from there to here. It really isn't. So I hope I was sufficiently vague not to.
There was a lot of words with not a lot of answers. In all fairness, I don't expect anybody to have that crystal ball, but I keep asking because I want somebody to surprise me.
Well, I will tell you one thing. We're going up by 2035. There's going to be a U.S. Space Force base on the moon, based off of its Space Guard component, that will be specifically exempted from the Outer Space Treaty for safety of life purposes.
You heard it here first, y'all. That's a Blue Marble Week exclusive. I fully endorse that. So fingers crossed on that. We're gonna swap over in a moment to Ed and bring on Sean McLean. Really terrific. Thank you very much. Very enlightening conversation. So great. Good. Thank you.
All right. Yes. Thanks again, Dr. Ziarnick.